What is a woman? You want to start a debate in the House of progressives and conservatives? Lob up that question and see what happens. Western society seems to have a hard time with defining woman, let alone who a woman is or what she does. This is a more recent phenomena, though I'm sure these kinds of questions have been debated on college campuses stretching back decades. Western society tended to assume women stayed at home and men were the breadwinners. The Industrial Revolution put a chink in that armor of these societal assumptions, but the real tremors began during the World Wars. With the men off to war, someone still had to work. You've seen the We Can Do It poster produced by J. Howard Miller in 1943 for Westinghouse Electric, and maybe assumed as a feminist manifesto captured in a picture. In reality, it was to boost female morale on the job. They weren't used to it. This female empowerment, if you can call it that, was less, let's do all the things a man can do, and more, the men are at war, someone's got to do it. But then the men returned from war, so now what? The cultural assumptions embedded in society started being questioned because women now had options. They could do many of the jobs men had done before. Yes, some of the more labor-intensive jobs were more particularly suited for the male body, but office work was available for both sexes. Men who weren't used to seeing women in the workplace were now confronted with them at every turn. A place dominated by masculinity began being infiltrated by the feminine, a clash of the sexes. Then you had the sexual revolution of the late 1960s and early 1970s, following decades of these clashes. The church, in turn, reacted to this revolution. They looked at female empowerment and didn't see the underlying issues. Yes, there were outliers in sexual promiscuity and drug use run rampant, but not as much as you might think. Women entered a male-dominant space, and the men simply weren't having it. The church was scared. The church saw this and fell on the opposite end of the spectrum. Anything feminist is bad. And today, we've got the same issue. The church, in response to the sexual revolution, gripped even tighter on traditional gender roles, so society, in response to the church, loosened them. It loosened the roles first, and then gender. Man and woman were no longer the two genders on the biological menu. There's now a cornucopia of options on tap. So, while the culture loosens their definitions, the church tightens hers. If a young woman is looking for guidance on being a woman, who do you think she's more likely to turn to? That which doesn't give her a straight path, or that which does? And with the advent of social media, this guidance towards a stricter version of womanhood and motherhood becomes glitzy. The women joined because of the positive black and white vision on offer to them in a grayscale world, while the men, with fond memories of a sort of manufactured past, desire the same next to them. A patriarch needs his matriarch. The biblical man needs his biblical woman. The man has his vision of manhood and fatherhood, so the woman needs her vision of womanhood and motherhood. Welcome to episode 14, Second in Rank. Let's get feminine, not feminist. In this episode, we'll talk with Beth Allison Barr, the author of The Making of Biblical Womanhood, Cait West, author of Rift, Hannah Oliver, and Sheila Gregoire, author of The Great Sex Rescue and She Deserves Better. We'll also hear from Doug about feminism, femininity, authority and submission, as well as his two daughters, Rachel Jankovic and Rebecca Merkel, the official spokeswoman of the movement. What is a woman? What does she do? How does she relate to her husband, her kids, and the world around her? Let's find out.
This is why it is so important to emphasize that Scripture also requires wives, in multiple places no less, to not be insubordinate. This is because all Christian wives, in all Christian marriages, occupy a subordinate rank. And it is always bad for a subordinate to be insubordinate. And if a woman's first instinct upon reading something like this is to stumble over the word subordinate and to rush in to say something like, but in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, ensign or lieutenant, your response should be to say, quote, that is quite correct and entirely true and also not what we were talking about. And your second response, internally, not out loud, should be to cross her off your list of prospects. You would both be miserable together.
First thing you must know about a trad wife is she's subordinate to her husband. Yes, there are female influencers in this movement, led by the all-powerful but submissive voices and pens of Rebecca and Rachel, the Wilson daughters, but their siren call is to pull their followers below their husbands, not to seduce them. But it's not enough to be a subordinate. Among the rank and file receiving your marching orders from the person in charge, your husband, you got to show it.
Submission that is invisible is not really submission at all. As submission is cultivated in the home, it needs to be expressed. It cannot exist as a set of hidden resolves or good intentions. Respect must be verbalized, and the demeanor of submissive deference must be plain to everyone in the home.
Saying your submissive wife ain't enough. Acting out your submission is. I want you to sit in that for a moment. The trad wife submission has to be visible. It's fine and dandy for the Wilson daughters to exercise authority, but they're from the bloodline of the Almighty. You better show your submission, or else Wilson and your husband won't be fond of you. Where does this idea come from, you might ask? Not just the traditional wife or stay-at-home mom, but the submissive woman at the beck and call of her husband. Who came up with this? What are its historical and supposed biblical roots found? For that, I talked with Beth Barr.
My name is Beth Allison Barr, and I'm the James Vardaman Professor of History at Baylor University. And I think people know me best for the 2021 book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. And I also have a new book that is a companion to The Making of Biblical Womanhood coming out called Becoming the Pastor's Wife, How Marriage Replaced Ordination as a Woman's Path to Ministry. And how I came into contact with Wilson is it was a slow build, I think, before I realized who Doug Wilson was and the influence that he had. My entry into this very hardcore patriarchy was when I was in high school, and I went to a Bill Gothard conference with some people from our church. And that was my introduction to this type of hardcore patriarchy. And as I wrote in The Making of Biblical Womanhood, it almost buried me. And I was very lucky to have moved away from that in college and gotten out of the relationship that I was in at the time. But it gave me a firsthand glimpse and firsthand experience of the danger of ideas that treat women as less than men. And after my exposure to Gothard, I sort of had my radar up for other types of hardcore patriarchal teachings. And this was when I began to hear about a man named Doug Wilson. And what worried me about Doug Wilson is that I saw similarities between him and Gothard in the way they taught this authoritarian structure where the husband is the umbrella. God made him the umbrella over the family, and that the wife is to be under the authority of her husband, and the children are then under the authority of the wife, who's under the authority of the husband, who then is taught is representing the authority of Christ. And I also became aware of him because the church that my family was in Waco for 15 years, where the story I tell in The Making of Biblical Womanhood, had a large contingent of homeschooling families. And many of them were very conservative families, and many of them followed Doug Wilson because of that. And some of them got into the particular type of classical education that comes from Doug Wilson.
Yeah.
And so I began to hear his name frequently from my friends at church and recommendations for his literature. So even though he was in Moscow, Idaho, the influence of him was all the way in Waco, Texas in the early 2000s and even into, during my time we were at that church, which was until 2016.
These ideas do not begin with Wilson. They flow through him. He's building off the work of Bill Gothard, founder of Institute and Basic Life Principles. You'll hear many survivors of abuse in this series talk about the influence Gothard had on their life and the baton passed on to Wilson. The 2023 Netflix series Shiny Happy People brought him to the national audience. He was already well known among this audience. So how did Beth Barr find herself writing and researching on womanhood?
So my life, my whole life was kind of two different but parallel roads going together. And one of those lives, I was a pastor's wife in a Southern Baptist and evangelical conservative context, which subscribed to male headship and female submission. And my other parallel life was I was earning my PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in medieval and women's studies with a focus on church history. And so I remember my conversations in my grad seminars at Chapel Hill. I was in one particularly on women at the same time that the Southern Baptist Convention, just literally, which at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which was a neighbor to us. And it was run by Paige Patterson and his wife, Dorothy Patterson. And they, of course, were the ones who fought to get the Southern Baptist Faith and Message changed to emphasize male headship and female submission, and that women couldn't be pastors. So I remember having those academic conversations about what was going on while I was living this change within, because at that time we were in a Southern Baptist church. So I think what happened is that as we remained in this type of conservative space, and we also, both my husband and I are lifelong learners, which is the phrase they like to say. So we were always reading and talking about things. And it became apparent that supporting male headship and female subordination was incompatible with the research that we were seeing coming out, and the historical research, as well as the biblical research, and actually understanding what those passages meant. And it created a crisis for us. I mean, I tell the story when I told my husband, in The Making of Biblical Womanhood, when I told my husband for the first time that I could not support male headship anymore. And the slow realization from that was like, well, what are we going to do? Because we've lived in these spaces where this is what it's taught to be a godly woman. To be a godly woman is a woman who supports her husband and a woman who submits to the authority of her husband and always puts her husband's career first. And so what does it mean if you no longer believe that? So if that, and I tell people the Making a Biblical Womanhood wasn't something I meant to write. I set out to write. Sort of a confluence of events when I realized I had the unique perspective as a medieval scholar who studied women in the church, as well as the lived experience of a woman in these spaces. And so that's where the book was actually born. But my realization moving away from biblical womanhood had begun to happen around 2012, 2013.
You heard a few episodes back about Doug's understanding of the Trinity and how the three persons of the Godhead relate to one another. The Father's authority and the Son is obedience. Therefore, he argues, in a marriage, the husband is authority and the wife is obedience. Bada bing, bada boom. Here's Dr. Barr on authority and obedience in the marriage relationship, especially as it relates to the obedient submission of the wife.
So, the paradigm this sets up for women is that women were created by God to not be in control, to not be in charge of their own lives, honestly. That they were created to be supporters and helpers. And the way that is interpreted is not actually in the biblical term where we see the supporters and helpers are God. The word helper is actually used for God. It's not that type. It is to be supportive and submissive wives. So this creates a paradigm that to be a godly woman, you have to be married, which puts out all of these women who don't feel called to be married, who don't want to be married, or if whatever circumstances in their lives, they have not gotten married or they have left their marriage. And so it places all those women outside of that godly paradigm. And, I think this causes the damage that this has done to women who are not married is, I don't even know if we're going to ever know the cost of this theology for single women. It also creates the paradigm that women's primary job, and this is their primary job given by God, is to support their husband. Their marriage centers on their husband. So it's okay for them to work if it is supports their husband, their husband is always the central figure. Everything that they do, it's okay for them to do as long as it still centers on their husband. And so what it creates is what I would call precarity within this relationship, where how good a woman's marriage is, how good a woman's life is, depends not on her, but on how good her husband is and how much he exhibits the fruits of the Spirit over authoritarian leadership. And so she becomes a dependent figure who is left up to the goodwill of her husband. I've been reading, I have this book coming out on the pastor's wife, which means I read Nancy Wilson, Doug Wilson's pastor's wife book. And she makes this crystal clear. In fact, she has a passage where she says, she has a whole chapter called loyalty. And it's on that women should be loyal to their husbands. And this includes when their husbands do something that makes them have a crisis or where they have to leave ministry. And you can imagine that this includes also sex abuse, et cetera, things. Yeah. And she said, while there may be some instances where a woman has to leave her husband, that really a woman should put first this loyalty. Because if she's loyal to her husband, even through these difficult things, it can help bring him out better. And so even in these moments of crisis, a woman's first God-given responsibility is to focus on the needs of her husband.
In no way do I want to suggest that women should not be devoted to their husbands, and in the same vein, that husbands should not be devoted to their wives. But this conversation tends to go one way in the patriarchy trad wife camp. The wife is devoted to her husband. Rarely do you see the husband devoted to his wife under all circumstances. If the wife begins questioning, she's gone. If the husband begins questioning, or is questioned, she'd better stay. Part of this loyalty to her husband is making sure someone is manning the ship, the home. Women stay and keep the home because a reason? I'm not sure why, but Doug thinks he knows.
I have a series of questions related to women working outside the home. To start with, can you give a general view on it when you think it's wise or unwise?
Our culture's old way of putting it was a woman's place is in the home, which I don't think is biblical at all. I believe the Bible teaches that a woman's priority is the home in a different way than the husband's priority is the home. She's the one she's the executive director of the home. She's the one responsible for the management of the home, the smooth running of the home and everything. So that's her priority. That should be her orientation. That should be her home base. But if you take what the Bible teaches about a woman's role, a good place to go is Proverbs 31, the ideal woman there.
Doug would never go so far as telling a woman that she can't work outside the home because his daughters do. That would be reckless of him. He chooses to be reckless in other areas of his teaching, thankfully not this one. But his use of the Proverbs 31 woman is confusing. It sure seems like she does a lot on a surface level reading. She keeps the home, does business in the marketplace, is some sort of real estate developer or buyer. She keeps her husband and her kids happy, and much more. What does her husband do? It seems like he just works. If anything, the Proverbs 31 woman is the authority in that relationship. I don't even have time to talk about where the book of Proverbs falls in the Hebrew ordering of the canon. Proverbs is followed by Ruth in the Hebrew ordering, meaning Proverbs 31 is followed by Ruth, the only other woman described as a valiant woman. Not your typical woman, according to Doug Wilson. She pursued. Which is funny, because that's certainly not how women are taught to act in public, nor how they're trained for their life of marriage and household duties. Here's Cait West, whom I spoke with last episode, author of Rift, on the strange stay-at-home daughter movement in patriarchal circles, the training ground to be a trad wife.
So a stay-at-home daughter was this concept that was popularized in Vision Forum, especially with this book called So Much More by the Botkin sisters. they were teenagers, I believe, when they wrote this book. They were not married. So it was this idea that because a girl's goal is to get married and have as many children as possible, it would be a waste of time for her to go to college or pursue a career. And even if she was going to pursue a career, it was dangerous because it would teach her how to be independent and think for herself. And so all of those things became banned for a lot of these families I knew in this movement, the patriarchy movement, because girls leaving home meant that they would have too much independence. And so we were told we had to stay home until we got married. And my father told me I wouldn't be an adult until I got married. So I did not understand that is coercion, especially when you're a legal adult. You are supposed to have choices. I didn't understand what was really happening. And I just believed that I needed to obey my father, and that would be obeying God. And even if I disagreed with some of the things my father did, I would be blessed by honoring that. And so I stayed for a very long time. I stayed until I was 25. I went through, I say 1.5 courtships because I went through a whole courtship.
Yeah.
And
I'll get into your courtships in a second. Yeah.
yeah. And so I had that experience. It was really pivotal for me and in figuring out what I wanted to do with my life and how I was going to leave and choose something different for myself.
And this training ground preps a woman for courtship, when her father runs her dating life and, for all intents and purposes, chooses her husband for her. Because, like Doug Wilson says, a woman is always under authority. That authority just transfers when she grows up. Here's Cait West on courtship.
There were different methods of courtship in this movement, and it depended on the father and the father's preferences. So my father followed a certain guidebook, and he promoted that to our church and to anybody he knew. It was called The Pathway to Christian Marriage. It's written by a man named John Thompson. If I'm not mistaken, I think he was also in the OPC, but I would have to check on that.
Mm-hmm.
And this booklet is still available online. You can download it. It teaches you how to have a courtship process that follows a literal interpretation of Bible stories, particularly the Old Testament Bible stories. So like, for instance, it takes the story of how Abraham found a wife for Isaac, and it takes lessons from that to create this process that might work in the modern world. And certain things about it was you can't ever be alone with someone you're in a courtship with. So you always have to be chaperoned. You can't talk about anything that might instigate emotional attraction or, heaven forbid, physical attraction. So you have to go through questions with your father to determine if you're eligible to get married to each other. And the Pathway to Christian Marriage has a list of questions you're supposed to go through. And once you do that, if your father approves of the match, he can say you can get married or you can get betrothed. And then at that point, the young man can ask the young woman to marry him. And it was always framed as, at that point, the woman can say no, right? She has that option to say no. That was presented as, this is why it's consent and not an arranged marriage. Mm-hmm. But once you go through that process, and if this is a person your father wants you to get married to, there are very limited options for you. And saying no was almost unimaginable at that point. So I would argue it's not really much of a choice for the women in these situations. So once you say yes and you become betrothed, you sign a covenant document to say that you are committed to marrying this person. And so it was taught that this was on the same level as marriage, just wasn't a legal marriage yet. And if you wanted to break up, that would be equivalent to a divorce. So betrothal was very serious commitment. And that was the point when you were allowed to have emotional attraction to the other person. So you're allowed to let that grow, which I guess is a switch you can turn on. But you're still not allowed to have any physical contact with the other person until your wedding day. So no kissing or anything like that until your wedding day. When your father turns his daughter as his property over to her husband as his property. They wouldn't use that term property. I use that specifically because that's really what's happening. They would say that he was turning his headship over. And so it was a method of getting married that was very much not like dating. Dating was taught as a practice for divorce, and courtship was taught as the true biblical way to find a godly marriage and honor God with your life.
Don't have feelings, but you need to find a husband who can protect and love you. Don't wake up love before it's ready. You never know what might happen. We'll get into feelings in a little bit. But the stay-at-home daughter movement, courtship, the priority of the home, and submission, have they always been at the center of the Christian worldview? Was this always the standard of womanhood? Motherhood is a wonderful thing, but was that always the peak of a woman's existence? I asked Dr. Barr, has this always been the case?
Yes and no. So on the yes side, when we look at women in history, there are always continuities with women as wives and mothers because women are the one who give birth to children. And so we see these continuities that, you can look back and, these continuities about narratives about women as mothers, narratives about women as wives, etc. Yet at the same time, biblical womanhood, as we have seen it today, is very modern and very new and very unlike much of what we see throughout church history, which is why I argue that biblical womanhood isn't biblical, that it is based more on modern cultural assumptions than it is actually on biblical text.
Well, darn. If biblical womanhood, trademark pending, isn't quite as historical as we thought it was, what is? What can we point to and say, aha, that's where this comes from? Where in history do we see a woman subverting and denying the mandate given her by God to be the authority or under the authority of her husband? This movement is all about authority. So, there must be someone we can blame for women gone rampant. As always, Doug's got the answer. Eve.
The Lord tells the woman two things. First, he says that her desire will be, quote unquote, to thy husband. Secondly, he says that the husband will rule over her. We know that this is a desire to usurp the husband's authority for two reasons. The first is because of the context of the immediate past. This sin is what had brought about the fall. Eve was beguiled and corrupted by the serpent and took on herself a position that was not hers to assume. She was the one who took the initiative in the sin.
Eve, you messed it up for all of us. Now all women everywhere want to usurp the authority of all men everywhere. Eve is now Steve, and Steve is now Eve. Just don't go on reading Romans 5, because it doesn't seem Paul got the memo. The blame for humanity's plight is placed on Eve's shoulders. Here's Romans 5:12. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. And Paul goes on in Romans 5:14. Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking the command, as did Adam, who is a pattern of the one to come. If you listen to the last episode, It's Only a Matter of Rank, you heard the blame shifted to Eve, referencing 1 Timothy 2 on Eve's deception. Eve wants authority, but she was deceived, so she can't handle it. She can't handle the truth. Women since Eve have longed for authority over their husbands. They've never been satisfied with their rank.
Now, in a well-ordered biblical relationship, the practical authority structure functions in accord with the formal rank. Quote, wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. Ephesians 5:22. When a wife does this, what is happening in real time is the same thing as what Scripture outlines on the flowchart. Everything is rightly ordered. But the disparities of ambition, talent, charisma, and sin can cause severe dislocations in a husband-wife relationship.
A trad wife is a woman of rank, a woman of lower rank than that of her male counterpart. She can rest assured she's got many at her level, but they all seem to be the same gender. They can look up, but they can never grasp at that rank. If they do, they can be sure they'll be crossed off the list of a good, biblical, patriarchal man. I believe all scripture is inspired and breathed out by God, and this isn't the time to flesh that out. But something that happens in the patriarchy trad-wife movement is the selective use of scripture, and the use of that scripture to read everything else through. So I asked Dr. Barr about the use of certain biblical texts across the history of interpretation on male-female dynamics.
Those are great questions. So again, the answer is yes and no. Yes, those passages have always been present throughout church history, but they were not always interpreted the same. And in many places, those verses always also, like in the medieval church, which is my area of specialty, on the one hand, we do see familiarity with these verses, but at the same time, they are not preached in sermons. They are not things that ordinary medieval Christians would have heard on a regular basis. What ordinary medieval Christians would have heard was on the equality of their souls. And they also would have heard that they would have been very familiar with women in the church who were in authority positions and in religiously authoritative positions. There was much more emphasis put on figures like Mary. Yes, Jesus came as a man, but he came through the body of a woman. And this was emphasized. In fact, there's a medieval sermon I use a lot, says that you should not condemn women for Eve, because God chose women to save the world. And so, there's this yes and no that, and I think this led to those verses are there, but they are not used as blanket prescriptions against women. And women were also seen spiritually as being able to achieve full equality with men. So some women, through focusing on giving their lives over to God, could actually achieve the same type of religious authority as men. It is not until the modern era, and I would argue really since the 19th century, that these, and with roots of it in the English Bible translations of the 17th century, so I'll put that out there too. You can think about Puritan movement, but it really explodes more into the mainstream in the 19th century, where these verses, and Phyllis Triple calls them the texts of terror, and you can think 1 Corinthians 14, 1 Timothy 2, Ephesians 5, all those household code passages explode as the primary lens to look at women. And every biblical passage about women begins to be read through those verses. And that does not happen until really the 19th century, and explodes in the second half of the 20th century.
Like we've got our favorite shows, books, music, and themes, we have our favorite verses. Thank you, Christian Store mugs and Verse of the Day calendars. We salute you. It seems like you can pull a verse out of the text and support whatever you like, no matter how oppressive it seems, because it comes from the Bible. Deal with it. Let's get to know another woman who fell into the grips of the trad-wife movement and how that happened.
So my name is Hannah Oliver, and I want to start with a caveat. My timeline is not perfect, as a chunk of time has passed since I was introduced to Douglas Wilson and Apologia Church. To protect myself, I deleted my primary Facebook account and removed myself from these circles as much as possible. So I'll be speaking in approximations for when these events occurred. So I was introduced to Douglas Wilson sometime in 2016 through a few different avenues. The first was Apologia Studios and Sheologians podcast. Sometime in 2014, I found Apologia Studios street evangelism videos to Latter-day Saints. At the time, this was something that my husband and I were really passionate about, and so we started to consume a lot of Apologia Studios content. We were living in Arizona, and I had the opportunity in 2016 to do street evangelism with Jeff Durbin and some members of his church. We were complete strangers, and admittedly, I was a little starstruck. Being young and naive, I was immediately drawn in by his quick-witted answers and charismatic personality. I was amazed by his wealth of knowledge, and I really wanted to learn from him. Despite living an hour and a half away from Apologia Church, I wanted to be more involved and was presented with the opportunity to participate in their End Abortion Now event, where I worked concessions. It was during this event that I met several prominent members of the church. This was the first time that I met Joy Hunter and Summer Jager White from Sheologians podcast. I found Summer to be incredibly warm and very personable. Overall, my interactions with Apologia Church left me feeling like I had just found a Christian community that I could invest in. To say I was excited would actually be an understatement. I was craving solid Christian community after an unfortunate church split in our local community, and I was uniquely vulnerable to these lofty theological arguments paired with this tight-knit community. It felt like I had struck gold. So we lived in a different city, and to our dismay, could not be members of the church, but that really didn't stop us from interacting with almost all the content that they produced. And when I say all, I mean all. We began to introduce close friends to the church, and I started to become radicalized fairly quickly. Longtime views that I held, I began to question when they weren't in alignment with Jeff. I really, really admired him, and I wanted to learn everything I could from him. We attended the church at least a dozen times over several years and watched the church grow rapidly. People from far-off communities moved to Phoenix to become members of Apologia. Close family friends were members, and we began to meet more and more people from the church. We sincerely loved the church, and we were very invested in its growth and success, even from afar. So as time went on, I started to hear the names like Rebecca Merkel, Rachel Jankovich, Douglas Wilson, and Canon Press. Because these names were coming from theologians, Jeff Durbin, James White, Luke Pearson, Marcus Pittman, and others who were involved in Apologia Church, I believed them to be solid and trustworthy people. The second avenue was through Facebook groups. So I had joined a group called the Reform Pub, which was made up of approximately 20,000 members, and a much smaller group of about 1,200 members called Blessed Bumps. Blessed Bumps was a group for young mothers who were seeking out a community of like-minded Christian women for support. And the Reform Pub was for debate and dialogue among Reformed Christians and those interested in Reformed theology. It was in the Reform Pub that I began to hear Douglas Wilson be portrayed in a negative light. Talking or promoting him at the time was against the rules. And it was in Blessed Bumps where the admins of the group spoke very positively of Douglas Wilson. So it was through my involvement with Blessed Bumps that several older women essentially took me under their wing and began to spiritually groom me to accept their doctrinal leanings. There's really no other way that I can phrase it. It's my opinion their intentions were deliberate and calculated. I speak in these terms because when I eventually came out against Douglas Wilson and Federal Vision, these same women would gaslight me, lie about me and to me, and call me names for questioning their theology. I watched countless Baptists become diehard Douglas Wilson fans and Federal Visionists because of Blessed Bumps' influence.
We'll have more stories later on in this series about Apologia Studios, theologians, and the whole lot of Doug Wilson adjacent fanboys and fangirls. Whereas many, like Cait West, were born into it, or, as you'll hear next episode, married into it, some stumbled on it, like Hannah. The online communities are easy to join, but hard to leave. But Hannah started reading, she started learning, and she started questioning. Doug Wilson is notorious for saying the quiet thing out loud when other pastors are a little more filtered. Rebecca Merkel and Rachel Jankovich are guarded in their speech, less so in their books. What they say is wild. Hannah will read you a few sections, those directed to men and those directed to women. How do they differ? Here's Hannah.
So it's worth noting that men and women are presented with very different reading material. The material that's marketed towards women is often softer, feminine, and tends to focus on domestic work. As for men, the literature is more masculine, theological, and focuses on how men should lead their wives. Women are not reading as much as their husbands, and so they're not exposed to as much of the theology as their husbands. This is, of course, a generalization that I'm making, and not all women fall into this category. But from my personal experience, this was something that I noticed. So for some books that I've read, they include, for women, I have read The Fruit of Her Hands and Learning Contentment by Nancy Wilson. I've also read Praise Her in the Gates by Nancy Wilson. I've read Even Exile by Rebecca Merkel. I've read You Who, Why You Matter and How to Deal with It by Rachel Jankovich, and Loving the Little Years by Rachel Jankovich. And then for men, I've read books just by Douglas Wilson. So I've read Reforming Marriage, Why Children Matter, The Covenant Household, Father Hunger, To 1,000 Generations, Fidelity, How to Exasperate Your Wife and Other Short Essays, Get the Girl, Against the Church, and Reformed is Not Enough. So themes that are common in the books directed at women include how to be a biblical wife and mother, Obedience is a really big theme, specifically when it ties back into being a good wife and mother, being feminine, being content in rejoicing in your role, and another really important one, how to gain control of your emotional life. Themes that are common in books directed at men, and this is exclusively works by Douglas Wilson. They include how to lead your wife, how to fight the culture wars, theology, how to be masculine, how to lead and discipline your children, providing for your family, protecting your family. So I'm not going to cover all the books I've read, but I will give you a brief synopsis or review of a few so that you get a good idea of the teachings found in some of their literature. So I was first introduced to The Fruit of Her Hands by Summer Jaeger White and Jeff Durbin's wife. They were doing a book club in Apologia Church surrounding this book, and they had shared about it on Facebook. I did not read it until many years later, but to summarize the book, it calls women to obey God by finding their value and worth in their home, under their husband's leadership, by finding joy in the mundane tasks of life. It's a call to obey not the commandments in scripture, but rather a set of expectations that are common in traditional wife culture. And I'll get more into what trad wife culture is later. If your husband wants you to homeschool, you will submit. If your husband wants more children, you will submit. If you want counsel and your husband says no, you will submit. If you are late on your bills, your husband will worry about it. These are all examples that Nancy gives in the book. Generally speaking, Nancy conveys that one is to focus on the home, raise your children in the Lord, and avoid tasks that are reserved for your husband. That includes protecting, leading, and providing. Some notable quotes from this book include, what a great protection it is to have a head to submit to rather than being swayed by our own emotions, whims, and fears, page 17. Is her identity as a Christian woman centered under Christ around her relationship to her husband, page 19. Paul teaches that women are more easily deceived than men, page 26. And I'm not trying to make this too simplistic, saying that if you respect your husband, all your troubles will go away, but frankly, most of them will, page 33. So I was introduced to You Who, You Matter, and How to Deal with It by Rachel Jankovich, by her sister, actually, Rebecca Merkel, who sent me a free copy of the book. She had actually sent me the book because she wanted to convince me that my perceptions or opinions surrounding the book were misguided or incorrect, because I had read some other reviews and I was already starting to form an opinion of what I thought about the book. And so she was trying to change my opinion on it. This is a partial review that I actually wrote that is public, and it is on Goodreads and covers some of the major themes of the book. So the book has a lot of opinions on identity, void of right focus, and lacks empathy and compassion for those outside of Christ, with judgmental, harsh overtones for anyone who is trying to create a form of self-expression that is not within the bounds of the expected conformity to Rachel's brand of biblical. She offers an extremely narrow view on who God intends you to be, encouraging strict conformity, not to God's law, but rather an overcorrection against American culture. There are hints of shaming women who do not submit to being mothers and rather find fulfillment in other things, as though any form of expression outside of motherhood must be formed by an American culture and not influenced by God himself. Rachel uses a lot of words in a complex fashion to confuse her readers, and then inserts jabs in random places that pack a punch lacking in gospel graces, with a sprinkling of unbiblical standards as the cherry on top. She conflates sin with likes and choices and accuses all types of expressions as off base if they are not in step with her standard. She promotes asceticism, and the book reads more like a primer on the culture wars rather than a balanced book on identity in Christ. Another glaring issue is that Rachel constantly, in every form of media that she produces, assumes the gospel. She mentions the gospel in clear terms a handful of times, but does not give the indicatives before the imperatives. This causes you to focus more on how obedience is the joy-producing, soul-sustaining point of salvation, rather than Jesus Christ as the person. Her monocovenantalism shines through as we are exhorted to a type of obedience that smells more like we reside under a covenant of works rather than a covenant of grace. That obedience keeps, sustains, and grows you, according to Rachel, rather than Christ doing these things and the fruit of that union being obedience. The point of the book can be boiled down to you fleeing from disobedience to obedience, which takes the form of denial of good or morally neutral things that she deems are distractions or false identities. Some notable quotes include, as a culture, we love the idea of superfood. Think of obedience the same way it is the superfood of the believer, page 125. But the truth is that obedience is far more like a perfect fruit that meets all of our needs. It quenches our thirst and provides us with sustained energy, page 126. Obedience is not wasted on him or lost on him. We can have complete confidence that if we live a life given to him in this way, in a million small acts of obedience, we are safe. Page 161. We as Christians need to stop thinking of our feelings as insight. Our feelings are something that we need to manage. When our feelings are acting up, who is to discipline them? We are. Who is to treat them with reverence? No one. Page 180. And lastly, Christians should be far more inclined to view our feelings like a bunch of monkeys that we are responsible to keep in cages, train, and disregard completely when they are acting up. Page 181. So it's worth noting that the themes of taking control of one's emotional life is something that Rachel talks about a lot, both in her books and through paid content on Canon Press website, which I have listened to. Her mother also touches on it, but not as vigorously and passionately as Rachel. Another quote that I want to share is from a cult expert, Janja Lalich, in Take Back Your Life. And she states, considering how powerful emotions are and how basic they are to survival and happiness, it is not surprising that they can be used to control people. Controlling someone's emotions means controlling that person. Cultic groups and abusive relationships manipulate emotions in order to influence and control people, retain them, and ultimately further the cult's and leaders' goals. Cult members are taught to distrust their feelings, to suppress certain emotions and foster others. Guilt, shame, and fear are all used to engender compliance and obedience. Many other feelings are punished, suppressed, or forbidden. I would highly recommend Lalich's book if you are a victim of abuse. So as for books directed to men, there are several categories. Douglas Wilson is a prolific writer, and he covers everything from raising young boys to his brand of covenant theology. Of course, I have not read everything that he's produced. That would be quite the challenge. But I have engaged with a great deal of his literature, and I will give a synopsis of the most recent book I've read, since it's just fresh in my mind. So Get the Girl by Douglas Wilson is a book that I read for educational purposes. No one recommended it to me. This book is written as advice from one man to another man on how to pursue a woman for marriage. It covers the topic of how feminism is toxic and that the culture has distorted how men and women should interact with one another. This is very heavy on reinforcing what a man is biologically and pushes back against the American culture. He also pushes against egalitarianism and talks a lot about how women are fundamentally created to submit to their husbands. The biggest themes of this book are that men are to lead, provide, and protect their wives and children. It's a primer on patriarchy. He does not mince words, and he makes clear that patriarchy is the biblical standard and any other view is that of the culture and should be abandoned. I don't have page numbers for these quotes because I read it on my Kindle, but some notable quotes include, feminism has not altered the fact that men still rule and still basically make the decisions. You are created by God to be the head, which means that you have a deep creational need to provide for her and protect her. That is what you are by God's creation design. You should want to be with a scriptural sweetheart and not with some egalitarian porcupine. This should not be difficult to understand. Godly women want to feed their men. Godly women are designed to make the sandwiches. This is not an absolute law, like the one about making babies. And there are times when a man fends for himself and makes quite a decent sandwich. But in the general scheme of things, the Apostle Paul wants the women to make the sandwiches. So I hope going over these 3 books just very quickly gives an idea of how men and women are instructed to live. It would take hours to do justice to all the content that's published by Canon Press and that's coming out of Christ Church. But overall, it's worth recognizing that these teachings are not fringe within the movement, but are rather staples. They reiterate their beliefs time and time again in all forms of media. So while you may have only read, say, Father Hunger, or you've only been exposed to one of Douglas Wilson's books, there's a great deal of overlap. He repeats himself a lot. And I mean, you're going to get the same stuff no matter what you're reading.
Yeah, I gotta say, the first one that you were quoting from is wild. The you who, that is, the quotes on obedience are wild.
And I can't remember how many, but so the first time I read her book, I went through with a highlighter and I highlighted every time obedience was mentioned and every time the gospel was mentioned. And it was just so out of balance. Like maybe the gospel, just the term gospel, not the gospel message being presented, but just the gospel, like handful of times, and then obedience every other word is how it felt.
The one that you pulled from page 126, like, is, I don't know how to wrap my mind around this, but the truth is that obedience is far more like a perfect fruit that meets all our needs.
Yep.
It quenches our thirst and provides us with this sustained energy. I'm like, that's exactly what Jesus does.
That is exactly what Jesus
which is wild.
Yeah. And around the time that she wrote this book too, there was a lot of people who gave her a lot of flack for the way that these quotes were worded, and she doubled down. She definitely doubled down, and she had said that she was not conflating justification and sanctification, and that she was essentially correct in the way that she was presenting obedience. It was interesting.
A woman's worth is in her home, children, and husband. Sure, lip service is paid to their worth in Christ, but it really comes down to how well prepared is your home, how obedient are your children, how delicious are your meals. Does your husband worry about anything inside the home, or have you taken that off his plate? Trad wives are a busy bunch. You also heard about feelings. Women have them, and so do men. I guess in a general sense, women are more in tune with them, speak more freely about them than men do, but we're all driven by them. Why are they such a big deal? Let's go back to Cait West.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to when I was younger and I was starting to have my first crushes on, the two boys at church that I had interactions with. And I would write my feelings in my journal, but then I would go back with whiteout and I would erase it all because I was ashamed of my feelings because I was taught that they were evil, right? Our feelings are our heart's deceitful. Our feelings don't matter. And so I internalized a lot of shame. I'm very much a shame internalizer. And so by the time I got to be 20 years old and in this first courtship, I was very well practiced at that kind of internalizing of shame. And so I tried really hard to follow the rules, but I found that being with somebody that often, and I was very much attracted to him, and I really enjoyed being with him, and I was imagining like maybe I'm going to get married to him, and what would that be like? I don't think it wasn't possible for me to not have any feelings for him, even at a base level of just like really caring about him as a person. And so just to have that naturally happen and then to be told you're actively sinning, it was very much that idea of cognitive dissonance where it was like it's not making sense that I'm being sinful by having a feeling that I can't really control. I had been so good at trying to repress my emotions. I was taught that was a control thing, that was a good thing. But I was finding that your emotions can't be controlled and they are guides to what you should be doing with your life. I didn't know that at the time, but it was just really a moment for me to understand that maybe my emotions weren't wrong and it was okay to love somebody. But I remember my father ended the courtship for different reasons. It wasn't because he was gay, because we didn't really know that. And even if it was, my dad would have said that's not a real thing. Mm-hmm. And anyways, so my dad ended the courtship after like 8 months. And I was very upset because I had no choice. I had no ability to make a different decision. I just had to submit and go on with my life and somehow forget that I had this connection with somebody. And I was heartbroken. And my father told me, you need to submit to me and repent of your feelings. And you are being sinful and you're cheating on your future spouse with your emotions. And I knew that was wrong. Like there was this deep sense of intuition I had at that moment that this is not correct. I can't be in the wrong for loving somebody. And I started to listen to that voice more and more after that moment. And it took me a few years to leave, but I really believe it was a time for me to understand that what I was being told didn't always mean that that was the truth.
You have feelings, they just gotta wait. Get married, just don't feel anything up until the wedding night when you're both in bed. Feelings are bad because your heart is bad. Logic is good because logic comes from where exactly? Can decisions be separate from your feelings? Does intuition play any role in your life? Women are stereotyped as the feelers and are called too masculine or a go-getter if they are too logical. Men, on the other hand, if they feel anything at all, are warned that they might get their man card revoked. Women's feelings are deceptive because they might seduce the man too early. Because he's too easily deceived, that can't be right. Here's another woman who has spent the last few years diving into the largest study ever done on women and marital satisfaction in evangelical circles. Essentially, she's asking the question, what do these teachings actually do for women and her life outcomes? Let's get to know her.
Sure. So I'm Sheila Wray Gregoire, and I am the founder of Bare Marriage. We have the Bare Marriage podcast, Bare Marriage blog, and together with Rebecca Lindenbach, who's my oldest daughter, and Joanna Sawatsky, we have done the largest research projects into evangelical women's marital and sexual satisfaction, and we've expanded that recently into men and married couples as well. And so we've surveyed almost 40,000 people at this point, really in-depth surveys to see how teachings in the evangelical church actually influence men's and women's marriages.
She surveyed a lot of people and a lot of women in particular. How did she come across Doug Wilson?
How I met Doug Wilson. I have a story.
Oh, let's hear it.
I do. Okay. So I homeschooled both my daughters all the way through high school from the beginning. And we used the Omnibus curriculum.
Oh,
which
okay. Yeah.
was written by Doug Wilson, put up by Veritas Press. I had never heard of Doug Wilson, didn't know anything about the patriarchy movement. And I liked a lot of the Omnibus series. But then we got to slavery and it was insane. And because he wanted us to read this book, which was basically saying slavery wasn't that bad. And then he wanted us to read Mein Kampf, like actually read Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, we're not doing that. And we're Canadian.
Okay.
And so a lot of the stuff around the Civil War, I just found really strange and off-putting. And I remember saying to my daughters, there's just something really weird about this. Like, I don't understand this because, yeah, I'd never encountered him. So it was really the slavery stuff that I saw first. Like, this is insane.
Okay. Okay.
When I heard about him with regards to patriarchy, probably, a decade ago on social media when he was pressuring someone to marry a pedophile. And then also when the story broke about the woman who had been abused by her youth pastor, and Doug Wilson had supported the youth pastor.
Credenda Agenda and the homeschooling curriculum, Omnibus to be exact, are the gateway drugs for all things federal vision, patriarchy, and Doug Wilson, the trifecta. Sheila's research interest above all else is sexual satisfaction, again, in particular for women. So how do these messages, patriarchal and trad-wife culture, combined with some of the most popular evangelical books on marriage and sex, affect women and their sex lives with their husbands? One book caught her attention, Nancy Wilson's The Fruit of Her Hands. Here's a section of it as read by Sheila.
Women need to take a more eager interest in making it a lovely garden their husband delights to spend time in. You want your husband to feel excited when he visits you, and you should never resent your husband's sexual advances as intrusive. And then later she says, women who find their husband's sexual advances intrusive are, and I quote, hanging a sign out on the garden wall that reads in large letters, "No trespassing." But of course, a husband is never trespassing in his garden, though he can be made to feel as though he is an intruder. So what she's saying is that marital rape doesn't exist because he owns her garden. He's not trespassing. And so the sin to her is not marital rape. The sin is a woman's reluctance to submit to coercion. That is the sin.
Yikes. Well, I guess it makes sense when the woman is submissive and subordinate, of a lower rank than her husband. The woman is a temptress, a walking seductress, looking to bring down men with her. Leggings and a sports bra are all she needs to crush a man's soul and secure his gaze. Men are helpless, you see, when a woman is not a trad wife. But if a woman's got no right to say no, those tables are flipped. The man's sexually ravenous appetite is only curbed the more often he can explore her garden, even when she doesn't want him to. For when she says no, she's begging him to have an affair and watch porn. He's helpless. Now, here's the Wilson daughters in their own words, now that you've heard their words read. We'll begin with Rebecca Merkel's trailer for her 2016 book, Even Exile.
Feminine glory is fruitful. It produces, it builds, it creates. And it does so in ways that are profound and staggering and surprising and beautiful and frequently messy and hilarious and ridiculous. Fruit is never, ever tidy, and building things always makes a mess. So keep your eye on the harvest and realize that in this world God made, the mud is an essential ingredient. Think about the finished house and realize that the sawdust is a given. As we build, as we glorify, as we try to imitate God in our fruitfulness, we should make sure that our vision for what that will look like is shaped by what God Himself has shown us and not what minimalist lifestyle magazines claim the beautiful life is. On the other hand, the mud isn't the goal. The sawdust isn't the final product. We're trying to build something glorious, and we need to be neither frightened of the dirt nor distracted into thinking the dirt is all there is. So be the glory of your husband. Be the concentrated, intoxicating, incarnate poetry that tells the story of death and resurrection, and then throw yourself into the task of glorifying. Be fruitful. Build your house. Work hard. Be ambitious. Be productive. Learn more. Run harder. Take the gifts God has given you, the desires He has given you, the constraints that He has given you, and then figure out how to weave those into something glorious, something compelling, a beautiful aroma that can't be contained and that beckons a broken world to come and taste to see that the Lord is good. Even Exile by me, Rebecca Merkel, now available on audio wherever audiobooks are sold.
Next, we have Rachel Jankovic, the younger of the two sisters. There's also a Wilson brother, but we'll talk about him later. The apple of controversy doesn't fall far from the dug tree.
Did you hear her? She's saying the worst things. We thought that it was time that I do a video where I just collect the most outrageous, scandalous things that I have said and put them all in one spot. We thought this would be helpful for any of you who want to be grabbing screenshots to make memes that talk about my heresy. Let me just put it all in one little spot for you so it's so easy. This is my scandalous position. Christian women are obligated to obey Jesus. That's it.
Like father, like daughter. When you talk about controversy, you're probably looking for more of it. Have no fear, though. Doug promises he's not reacting to feminism's reach. Rosie the Riveter has no effect on him. There's a continuum, he says.
At the same time, if Christians react to feminism, pull away from feminism and the corporate lies and all of that, by adopting sort of a quasi-Muslim approach to conservative Christianity, where women should be taught to read barely so that they can read the instructions on the side of the biscuit box and stay at home barefoot pregnant in the kitchen. If that's what you're after, that's not Christian either. That's just as radically unbiblical, sub-biblical as this other stuff.
Maybe you think this movement is fringe. Just a few women on Instagram showing off their insane kitchens, massive grocery budgets, 15 children, and adoring husband. It all feels too fake. Like a cardboard cutout that's really just a cover for the chaos inside. We're just waiting for it to tip over so we can see what's really happening inside. Dr. Barr would argue it's less fringe. There's just more or less extreme. Evangelical churches have been teaching this for decades, propping up a purity culture that was trying to respond to the promiscuity culture they feared would creep into the church. Let's connect back with her again.
That's the thing, that was the thing with Gothard too, is people thought he was this really weird right-wing fundamentalist that was very small circles. And now we're seeing how big the ripples are that came from his pool of influence. And I think Doug Wilson is similar. And I will also say that I have friends still in Waco who, there's a classical school in Waco, which is actually a really good classical school and is built on like Dorothy L. Sayers, et cetera. But a lot of people end up in that realm who think it's a Doug Wilson type thing and bring that influence. And so I still see in Waco, the influence of Doug Wilson is much more powerful than I am comfortable. I mean, I'm not comfortable with his influence at all, but I am extremely uncomfortable with how much influence I see in my daily life in Waco.
I've talked a lot about it, around it, and tried describing where it's come from. But what is trad wife culture? How is it related to the slightly older biblical womanhood movement? You see, the biblical womanhood didn't have Instagram. They had conferences. Social media changed the game, and you better believe it's being played. Dr. Barr continues with, what is this?
So I would say that the trad wife movement definitely stems from complementarian concepts. I don't know if it's a direct product of it, but it certainly stems from that same kind of cultural mindset and cultural milieu. That's a good scholarly word for it. It's in the water, so to speak, and it's in the water behind the trad wife movement. The trad wife movement is definitely born in social media. I mean, it's an Instagram phenomenon, and it's this idea of sort of, Instagram, as we all know, makes everybody's life look perfect. And so it is taking these ideas of biblical womanhood, which scholars, are was born in 19th century ideas about the cult of true womanhood, or the cult of domesticity, which is what it's called, which emphasizes the purity of women, the submissiveness of women, the piety of women, and women as mothers. And it is built on 19th century scientific ideas, kind of out of the Enlightenment, that women's brains are smaller than men's, and that women's bodies are built only for childbearing. So sort of this idea that you can think about in the late 19th century too is the explosion of Darwin, the explosion of evolution, the explosion of new ways of thinking about how bodies have evolved and changed over time. And so the idea is that women's bodies are built specifically to be wives and moms, and that their brains don't even have the capacity to be leaders and to be public figures. And this is the idea that the main thing women should do is be perfect wives and mothers. And Instagram created the perfect venue to model these perfect wives and mothers, women who, you can also think about the pioneer woman. She isn't a trad wife, but she's kind of like behind. I mean, she is maybe a model, whether she wanted to be or not, of this like living, staying at home, making your own bread, making your own butter from scratch, giving out all of these recipes, and even making your own clothes. Sort of this Little House on the Prairie motif in overdrive is what the trad wife movement is.
And here's Hannah Oliver, who lived it. When did she join, and what was it like?
So very early on, but it took me several years until I found balance. So I had started to head cover in church, and my views on men and women were becoming very conservative. I would consider myself during this time to be very patriarchal and anti-feminist. I was influenced a lot from Sheologians and the Blessed Bumps group that had many women who could be considered trad wives or traditional wives. So there is no agreed upon definition of what a trad wife is, and not everyone will use the word to describe their lived experiences. This word also wasn't being used readily at the time. However, the definition I would give is a hardworking woman who stays home with her children, homeschools, has as many children as possible, believes in traditional gender roles, and views their husband as the head of the home. There is a moral obligation to be at home in trad wife culture. Trad wife culture has grown a lot in recent years, and I can testify to how one can become very enmeshed in the culture and teaching. Being a stay-at-home mom is not the same thing as being trad wife, although they have a lot of crossover. To be a trad wife is to see the virtue and necessity in being at home. It is a moral obligation to see your home as your domain, and as a woman, it is where you rightfully belong. So I have a great deal of compassion for how women end up in these circles, as American culture more broadly does speak ill of mothers and speaks ill of being a stay-at-home mom. So many of these women find themselves in trad wife culture because they want to be seen as valuable in their roles. There's nothing wrong with being a stay-at-home mom, having more traditional values, homeschooling, homesteading, or anything like that. You can like to make sourdough bread. You can own chickens. There's nothing wrong with that. There is, however, tension within American culture that I believe leaves women in a position of feeling sidelined and undervalued for the work that they do at home. This leaves especially younger women very vulnerable to this type of ideology because it gives them a community of like-minded women who are very supportive of what they're doing. The biggest issue of trad wife culture is ultimately that one is morally better if they live this lifestyle, and it also isolates women from the outside world. Trad wife culture does offer mothers value and honor that oftentimes the American culture just fails to convey or appreciate. Unfortunately, like I just stated, the most vulnerable are young women who are new mothers who are seeking a community that values their work. I was personally very isolated during this time, even though it was pre-COVID. I did not have very many friends, and I was completely sequestered to my home. I had 2 little ones. They were a toddler and a baby, and I spent a bulk of my time on Facebook, and a majority of my relationships were online. When you're isolated in this manner and only exposed to one type of ideal, it is easy to be influenced. I craved the validation of being a good mother and of being a good wife that is offered freely in trad wife culture. I began to question the views because I personally didn't believe in having as many children as possible. I put my husband through college while I worked as a 911 dispatcher, so I didn't believe it was wrong for women to work outside the home. I had attempted to homeschool through encouragement of women in this group, but I struggled because of several mental health illnesses. And I'm an incredibly bold woman, and I often had difficulty submitting to my husband. I just did not fit the mold. Of course, I would doubt myself, and I would feel that I wasn't doing enough. I felt I was often in sin. But I would continually kind of come back to my positions that I held before being exposed to these groups. So I was being pulled in 2 drastically different directions. I'm thankful for a group and podcast called Theology Gals that helped to keep me from falling into the extremes of trad wife culture. It was through their influence that occurred right along all this other stuff. So from 2016 to 2020, they really helped to ground me and keep me more balanced during this period of my life.
So there's a difference I want to underscore that Hannah brought up. There's nothing wrong with being a stay-at-home mom. I had one myself. I love my mom, and I'm thankful for what she did with me and my 2 siblings. But that's different than trad wife culture. Doug Wilson can say until he's blue in the face, women do not have to stay at home. But what message do women in the CREC and broader evangelical world hear? It's better to stay at home than work. Again, I don't play favorites, but it's the pressure these women face to be that kind of mom who can do it all. The same pressures aren't on men. They face something entirely different. Once this movement captures you, it's so hard to leave it. It's a community of like-minded people. They help you through the ups and downs of child rearing, discipline, education, and cooking. They're with you when your marriage is tough, when your husband doesn't get home until late at night, when your sex life is suffering, when your children won't go to bed, and when you're wondering what you're doing with your life. When you've got no one outside the home, you start looking online, and they're there to take you in with open arms. Rebecca, Rachel, and Doug would never tell women, you must stay at home, but they'd certainly encourage it. And encouraging isn't far away from demanding. When everyone else is doing it, it's a hard drug to quit. So, if you find yourself interested in one of these communities or churches, or know someone who is, how should you talk to them? Here's Dr. Barr on talking to those ensnared. Instead of placing our hope in God, we're placing our hope in our husbands. What might she say to women who might be interested in this movement and trying to be biblical women and hopeful trad wives?
Gosh, my heart is there with those women. That's a main reason why I'm actually doing what I do and while I even do podcasts like this is because I know what it's like to be in a church. I know what it's like to be gaslit by being told, well, why are you being so prideful in wanting to be in charge? Isn't that, just the spirit of pride or the Jezebel spirit, which is like what we like to be told? It's so important. Being a homemaker is the most important thing. Why are you trying to think it's not a good thing? And so, this gaslighting, which, the argument is like, oh yeah, of course being in the home is a really important thing. Problem is when only women are the ones who are supposed to do it. And it is it's not that it's not important work, but it is below the skill of men. And you can think about that men are called to do higher and more important things. It's actually not women who argue that taking care of kids is less important than the work of men. It's men who make that hierarchy and place us below that hierarchy, which belittles both women as well as the care of children, which is just as important as anything else in the church. But because complementarian creates a hierarchy where they say leadership and salary, pay for the work that you do, benefits for the work that you do is only for men. And women's work all doesn't match up to that level. Women's work is not as important as men, and we show this by not paying women for their work. And we know that recent SBC poll that came out that showed that 82% of female workers, ministry leaders in the church, are either part-time paid or not paid at all for the work that they do. So I want women to know that I know exactly what it's like to be caught between that rock and the hard place. I know what it's like to be told that, yes, I am a college professor and I'm a college researcher, but me not being able to teach Sunday school it doesn't at all mean that I'm not a good teacher outside of the church. It just means that God has given me a different role. And that, this is what we are told, that we are just given a different role and that we should just accept that role because that's what it means to be a godly woman. And I think what men don't understand is that is demeaning. What that teaches women is that we are worth less in the eyes of God, that God created us not to fully be in his image and to fully live out whatever calling he's given us, but God created us solely to serve people who are actually higher than us. And that is the internal message that women are taught. And I know this because I internalized it and because women over and over and over again have told me that they internalize this. And so I want to validate the feelings that these women have. I want to validate when that feeling where we feel like, oh no, maybe I'm the problem, maybe it's sin, and that I need to struggle with my own heart because I feel led to preach, teach, and lead, and that must not be godly. The dissonance that creates for women, and also that separation from God. And Protestantism, if it teaches anything, it teaches that there is no separation for us from God, that women and men can stand before God in the same way. I would actually argue Catholicism teaches that too, but anyway, that's another whole theological argument. But anyway, so we can stand before God as equals, and that is how God has created us. The problem isn't God. The problem is a theology that has been created for the purpose of centering and propping up white male authority. That's the problem. It is not the problem for women who feel called to do these things.
Lastly, I asked Dr. Barr to talk to those women who said, screw it, I'm done.
I would tell them first that I'm sorry. I'm sorry the church, a place where they should have been encouraged in their gifts, where they should have been sent out to spread the gospel, which is the mission that all Christians are given, although we carry it out in different ways, where that should have been encouraged and nurtured and supported in them. Instead, they were told that they were prideful, that they were sinful, and that they were not allowed to do what God had called them to do. And I'm just so sorry that the church, I was complicit in this system too, that we did this. I want them to also hear, I think of the words of a young Asian woman who wrote me very, very early on after The Making of Biblical Womanhood came out. And she wrote me and she said, for the first time, I understand that God is for me and not against me. Mm-hmm. And I want these women to hear, and I want women who have survived the worst of patriarchy to know that the first person in the Bible who names God is a abused woman whose name is Hagar. Mm-hmm. And she names God the God who sees. Mm-hmm. And God sees women. And I think God is fighting for women. And I think part of the reason why our voices are coming out now, and that even podcasts like this, is God helping us to be heard and to be seen so that we can change the church.
I also asked the same of Cait West, a woman who grew up in this movement, and speak as one who left it.
The first group, the people who are attracted to this and are considering joining a church like this, I would say, first off, it's never as nice looking. It's never as shiny as it appears. Something like Vision Forum, like they're very good at marketing. Doug Wilson is very good at marketing his brand of Christianity. But once you live within that system, it's really not a good situation for anyone who doesn't have power. And so because the system depends on patriarchy, it sets up men at the top and women and children at the bottom. It's a situation that is ripe for abuse, and so many different kinds of abuse happen in patriarchal systems. And the problem is, especially for women, once you join and you say, I'm going to submit to this, you're giving up your agency. And there's no taking that back. They're not going to give that back to you. The only way to leave is to get excommunicated or to get cut off. And so it might seem like a good idea now because it promises security and this idea of certainty. But I think just as humans, we have that fear of uncertainty, and we're attracted to things that might bring us that sense of stability. But in my experience, it's a false sense of security because I never felt secure in that world of certainty. It wasn't until I left and had to embrace the uncertain aspects of life that I could find a sense of security within myself. But being in that world was not safe. And it can escalate very quickly, and abusers are never held accountable to the way they should be. And that's a problem with the system and the theology and the way they treat women. And I think it's not something that is going to change within that system. I think it needs to be dismantled in a certain sense, whatever that looks like. I'm not trying to be an anarchist or anything like that right now, but I just think it's important to look at the root of the problem and not just say, oh, it's just my pastor or that pastor. There's a bigger system at play here. For the people who are in it and who are struggling and want to leave, I know some stay-at-home daughters right now who are trying to leave, and it's difficult because I wish I could just pull them out and give them a place to be and give them a life, outside of it. And it's not as simple as that. It takes a lot of work to have the confidence to leave and to find a way on your own. I would say it's okay to take time to figure that out. If you're in danger, leave immediately and call the police. If you have a home and it's starting to feel unsafe and you're not sure what to do, it's okay to take some time to figure out what to do and to reach out to people. There are a lot of resources now that didn't exist when I was leaving. Tears of Eden is an organization I volunteer with. There's another one called the Vashti Initiative. And these kinds of supports can help you find solidarity and hope outside of the small world you might be living in. And with social media, it's really helpful to see other ways to live. And I always say, look at other people who have left and all the different ways they exist. And you get to choose what you want to do. You don't have to follow someone else's path out or someone else's choice in life. You get to decide what you want with the one life you have. And that can include faith. It could include not having faith anymore. It's up to you to determine that. And I want to encourage them to hold on to their agency, because that's what being a human is all about, is being yourself and showing up as yourself. And if you're in a world where you aren't allowed to be yourself, it's never going to be safe for you.
Hannah talked more to those women who found community and solace in an online community, those who stay at home and wonder, is there anyone else like me who goes through the same thing? She talks to you who are stuck and wondering, can I ever get out?
I mean, the first thing that I would say is it might not be realistic for these women to leave. They may have husbands who are totally sold out, and this is where they stay. And they might never leave these circles. And to these women, I would tell them that Jesus Christ died on the cross for her sins, that he rose from the dead on the third day, and that he will return. It's the message that we rejoice in. It is finished. Christ has died for our sins. And when we believe in the gospel message, we are saved. Christ has done it all. So as Christians, we forget that the central message of Christianity is what God has done on our behalf. We get so wrapped up in what we should be doing and how we should be pleasing God that we lose sight of the beauty of what has already been completed. I love Philippians 2:13, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. It is God who is working in us. He is sanctifying us. He gives us the ability to obey his commandments. When we are weak, he is strong. We need to lean on the gospel message, rest in what God has done, and trust that he is working in us for his good pleasure. So to the sweet mama who feels that she's just not doing enough, that she's just not obeying enough, I just beg of her to look to Jesus. And this may be even more challenging when you are sitting every Sunday listening to a sermon that gets the cart before the horse and doesn't tell you the gospel. And every week you're hearing the same message to do more, to obey more. And that's all you hear. You have to remember the gospel, because you might not get the opportunity to leave these churches. You could potentially be stuck. So that's the message that I have. I think it's the most important message for the people, for everyone who's a Christian, but most importantly for those who are in this movement, because the gospel is not talked about. And the gospel oftentimes is ignored or viewed as a lesser invaluable point when it comes to your life as a Christian. But it's the most important, and it's the central part of our life.
And I'll end again with Hannah's words of wisdom, filled with the aroma of Christ. To women who think their worth is wrapped up in their performance, the tidiness of their home, the crankiness of their babies, the obedience of their kids, and the stomachs and libido of their husbands. Where do you find your worth?
Yeah. I mean, this one is honestly really tough. I mean, first and foremost, I've been there. So I get what it feels like. But the thing is, there will be expectations of you in these groups. So in no specific order, here are some examples of the life you're expected to live. 1, there's an expectation that you will have as many children as possible. Not all people in the group believe this, but there is a big quiverful movement within these circles. 2, you will submit to your husband without complaint, and this includes sexually. 3, you will not work outside the home. Your home is your domain. 4, you will homeschool, or at least put your child in a Christian classical education. 5, you will not question the theology or the teachers. And 6, you will suppress your emotional life in the name of obedience. So if you deviate even a hair from these standards, you will be questioned, you will be reprimanded, and you may even face public church discipline for deviating from these standards. So the women and men in these circles are cookie cutter, and there is not much diversity in these circles. You are not joining a church, you are joining a cult. I say this with the utmost seriousness. If everyone looks like you, sounds like you, dresses like you, and believes like you, it is a red flag. Of course, there may be exceptions to these standards. Some people are in positions of power and they're given free passes. So, for example, the Wilson daughters, they are given platforms and jobs outside of their domestic roles. It is a job to communicate publicly on Facebook, on paid content on Canon Plus, and to write books. An author is a real job. And these are jobs that they find themselves performing that are outside their duties as a wife and mother. It's acceptable, though, because they are keeping other women under them in line. They are allowed to work in a capacity that is outside the home, and they are allowed to teach. But this freedom is not given to all women. So if you look at them and you think it's so wonderful, and you see Rachel or Rebecca or Summer, and you're thinking, wow, I love what they teach. I love the type of women that they are. The reality is that that's not going to be your life. You are going to be living a completely different life than they are. And there's different standards for you because you are not in positions of power. I would also caution that the grass is not always greener. Just because something appears a certain way does not make it a reality. So I know Peter is diving deep in this podcast series to show patterns and cultures of abuse in these groups and in these churches. But when you sign up to join, you are also subscribing to a culture that is abusive. So it is multifaceted, it is complex, and I would caution against it.
The trad wife is a manufactured life. The requirements to be a biblical woman are so high, you'll never reach them. The crying of babies will cause you to sink into a deeper and deeper depression because they're not able to meet all their needs. But your biological instincts combined with the theological message you've received convince you can. The burden is heavy and the yoke is impossible to bear. You might think your worth is wrapped up in your performance, but it's actually given to you. In every interaction with Jesus, the women he spoke with are never told, have more babies, tidy up your home, and have dinner ready for your husband before he gets home. He doesn't ask how satisfied your husband is in you, how many followers you've got on Instagram, how modest or immodest your clothing is deemed to be, how hidden you've kept your feelings, or how obedient your children pretend to be. He looks at you in the same way he looks at your husband, or your father, or your brother, or your son. The Father expects the same thing of you as he does of any man, your faith. Your faith is not your doing or your being, it's in his Son. His Son is sufficient for your obedience, your performance, your life, and your worth. I know that you know your life is a mess if you really let yourself go there, but that can be terrifying. When the messaging all around you is, be perfect because that's what is expected of you. Be more like Rachel, be more like Rebecca, be more like that wife who keeps her home ordered, her children fed, and her husband happy. But I guarantee you that woman is about to break. She puts on the face you try to when you walk into church, when her husband walks back on the door. That face you put up before all the women of the church and especially before your pastor. That's not a community, that's a performance. That's not a hospital for sinners, but a museum for saints. Except there's no saints, and that's not a museum. Rest in Jesus, he who disordered his life, that he might order yours. He who loved you enough, he gave up his life for you, that he might raise you up with him in his resurrection, and is with you even now. Who took your sin, no, not how bad that dinner was that one night, or your reaction to your kid that morning, upon himself. He gave you his record of perfection. That's what I'd like to call a traditional woman. Not because you're following some woman on the internet, but because you are following the tradition passed down through the ages. The tradition brought down by the apostles that Christ died, was risen on the third day, and ever intercedes on your behalf. That's a traditional woman, and I hope you believe that. I'd like to thank Beth Allison Barr, Cait West, Hannah Oliver, and Sheila Wray Gregoire for their time and expertise on this movement and how women are viewed. In our next episode, we talk about marriage, the patriarch and his matriarch. How does this movement view marriage, sex, and parenting? Is the wife the sex receptacle, the outlet for her husband's insatiable sex drive? How do messages about sex affect libido? How were children viewed and trained in this movement? That's episode 15, How to Rule Your Wife and Kids. See you then. Sons of Patriarchy is brought to you by the administrators of Examining Doug Wilson in Moscow in partnership with Peter Bell. It's written, produced, and edited by Peter Bell. Original music, sound design, and mixing by Aaron Feeney. This series wouldn't be possible without the dozens of abuse survivors whose bravery and vulnerability make it what it is. Every episode was sent to them before being published, and their feedback, edits, encouragement, and eventual approval make this what it is. May your voices be heard far and wide. Thank you.